Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this Google Hangout talking about social responsibility and risk in the supply chain. My name is Dick Gould. I'm an ASQ fellow and I'm the social responsibility liaison with the technical community councils of ASQ, and I lead a social responsibility peer group. I'm also a charter member and past chair of the customer supplier division of ASQ. And I'll be moderating this event along with Amy Siegler. Amy is an ASQ senior member, and she's the Customer Supplier Division representative on the peer group that I lead. She has an MBA from Green Mountain College, and she is Global Compliance Manager for Benchmark Electronics in Winona, Minnesota, a contract manufacturer of electronics. We have a panel with us today to discuss this topic, and I'll give a brief bio of each panelist. First is Kelly Eisenhart. Kelly is Executive Director responsible for environmental programs at Fair Factories Clearinghouse. Her focus is on enhancing and promoting the Fair Factories Clearinghouse audit program, specifically about factories' social compliance and corrective action plans. Then we also have Greg Hutchins. Greg is a principal engineer with Quality Plus Engineering, and he's founder of the Certified Enterprise Risk Management Academy, focused on enterprise risk management. He's author of many best-selling books on quality, supply management, and auditing. We also have Betty Kildow, who is a certified continuity planner who provides comprehensive approaches to enterprise risk management and business continuity management planning, training, and testing. So we want to welcome all you who might be viewing this and also welcome our panelists. Now I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who's going to start the discussion with our panelists, and I believe she's going to be talking with Kelly first.
Okay. Good afternoon. Kelly, through standards like ISO 26000, the UN Global Compact, SA 8000, the Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition Code of Conduct, and others, we've defined what ethical behavior looks like in terms of specific behaviors. But as a global community, how do we ensure that we balance the needs and respect the differences between different cultural norms while ensuring that standards are flexible enough to react quickly when new issues emerge?
Well, it's always touchy when you start talking about ethics, right? So as many codes of conduct as you can define, once you start putting into operations and practice, you always see challenges. I think, standards like ISO 26000 and things like GRI reporting, they're trying to bring some conformity and transparency to the issues, but in the end, those standards are still interpretive, voluntary, and subjective, notwithstanding, regulatory mandates. Part of ethics can be grounded in regulation, but it also is very subjective and interpretive depending on the culture you're coming from, whether it's a corporate culture or a global culture, or even your own individual interpretation. Tools come into play, right? So a lot of tools exist out there for social compliance, environmental compliance. Like at Fair Factories, what we do is we help companies by providing them with software tools that look at their third-party audits and put that data into a structured database so that they can share that information. Looking at things like critical action plans for different suppliers, looking at, what, not just from a regulatory perspective, but what's important within that corporate culture. A lot of times when we do these critical action plans, we're not just looking at, is that factory doing the amount of output and demand that we've asked them for, but we're looking at things like fire and factory safety. We're looking at things like worker rights and freedom of association. We're looking at environmental hazards or things like, do they use conflict minerals? So you know, imposing ethics all the way around the world is a really tough thing. But based on the Western ethics that corporations have come about with, I think we've got some tools that keep evolving to help bring us on track. Okay.
Kelly, this is Dick.
Sure.
What type of ethical issues do you need to address with the software tools that you provide different organizations for monitoring their environmental and factory conditions?
Well, this whole issue of ethics brings about a lot of questions because it's a balancing act, right? So corporations are trying to balance legal obligations with shareholder value and first world consumer price points, right? So they're focused on that. And a lot of them have plans, social compliance plans in place now to make sure that from their corporate culture and regulatory perspective, they're doing the right thing. But it's still a challenge. So like I mentioned, what Fair Factories does is help them collect this data. So Fair Factories actually builds audits. So we talked about standards earlier, ISO 26000, there's others, SA 8000. Companies can actually look at the standards that are out there and decide if those standards work for them. Or, for example, with our platform, not only can they use those standards, but they can actually create their own. So we do this thing called smart audits that allows them to actually design the questions that they want to find out answers to in their supply chain, collect that data back in, or even in the case of if they answer one question a certain way, it then brings up another series of questions, so they're like nested questions. So there's some intelligence behind the auditing. It's a complex arena. There's a lot of different aspects to look at from an ethical perspective. We look at if you just step back a little and take a bigger picture, you're not just talking about factory conditions. You're talking about hazardous materials in the product development life cycle. You're talking about packaging. You're talking about waste in the waste stream. You're talking about carbon footprint. And what we do is we help enable that. So we write software as a nonprofit and provide it to the members of the FFC as being members. So we have big retail companies like Adidas and Reebok, Eileen Fisher as customers using this. And what they do is this is one of the many tools in their toolkit to actually decide whether or not they're conducting their business ethically.
Well, it seems to me that the whole topic is very culture specific, particularly when we think of global supply chains and global suppliers. So I think the approach of the customizing that you do is probably the best way to go, and allowing companies to customize their tools.
And you kind of have to, because each corporation, each entity has their own list of priorities that they focus on. Some companies, and it really depends on the industry too, right? So some companies are more focused on that environmental hazards space, making sure that their products don't have bad materials in them, hazardous materials in them. Others that are, packaging intensive are looking at things like FSC certified forestry. And then again, others, especially like in the retail industry, are focused on that social compliance. How are people being treated along the path of the supply chain, and how do we measure and monitor that we're doing the right thing?
Okay, well, thank you.
Welcome.
Greg, I want to touch base with you a little bit here. Okay. I know that you're a risk guy, and we realize that dealing with suppliers, no matter where they are, always includes some level of risk. I mean, quality folks understand risk. It's variation. It's not meeting objectives. It's probability. So what does the term due diligence mean, which we read in the ISO 26000 standard? What does that mean in the context of evaluating the risks in selecting socially responsible suppliers in our supply chain?
Okay, well, that's a great question. And we're probably on the opposite side of where Kelly is, because we basically conduct due diligence from a legal, statutory level. And normally clients come to us if they want to unload the risk for a professional opinion for due diligence. So let me sort of share with you how we approach a due diligence engagement, and I think that would help. First of all, the definition of due diligence by 26,000 is a comprehensive and proactive process. So first of all, we parse that. What does comprehensive mean? What does proactive mean? To identify the actual and potential negative social, environmental, and economic impacts of an organization's decisions and activities. Well, again, we can basically look at actual impacts, but potential, the ones in the future, that's sort of hand-waving and crystal ball gazing. We can't do that. Also, we parse, scope down, social, environmental, and economic as much as we can. And we'll talk about that, why we do that when we conduct a due diligence. The other part of the definition is that it's over the entire life cycle of a project or organizational activity. Well, we want to understand, well, first of all, over the entire life cycle is very difficult, because for us we have two attestation vehicles. That's a legal term. And we want to basically look at the impacts at one point in time and then basically limit our exposure as much as we can. And then the other part of the definition is the aim of avoiding and mitigating negative impacts. So let me sort of talk about that for a second, and then we'll look at how we define due diligence. We basically parse social responsibility due diligence in terms of one thing. What's the level of assurance the client wants? Now, for us, assurance has lots of shades of gray, from the low end, which might be a management letter or an agreed upon procedure, or on a high end, due diligence for us would be a legal, binding forensics report, where we would give it to the board or an enforcement activity or to a legislature for testimony. So there's a wide variation of what we would call due diligence. And again, that's based upon the assurance level the client wants. So in terms of your specific question, in selecting suppliers, we developed 5 questions, and we'll go through each one of those, and we'll give the mic back to you. The 5 questions for us are, what type of products and services does the supplier provide? Second question, what type and level of social responsibility and environmental risks can the supplier pose to the client organization? Third, what level of assurance, which is the critical question, does the client organization want or require of the supplier or of a third party such as us? What's the client's budget to develop the level of assurance? And is a level of assurance and budget commensurate with each other? Fifth is, finally, what's the level of residual risk that the supplier, what's the level of residual risk from the supplier that's acceptable to the client organization? Now those 5 questions basically deal with the client wants everything in terms of the supplier assurance, but reality, the budget can be very, very constrained. And if you're looking basically at a low-level assessment, such as a ISO or a walkthrough or an agreed-upon procedure, that's X amount of time. But if you're looking at a forensics, that could be 3, 4X level of effort. So anyway, it's very, very intense question, but not a simple answer.
Yeah, that last question that you asked the suppliers deals with the whole topic of their risk appetite, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah, how much are they willing to live with?
And that's basically where the level of assurance comes in. And if their risk appetite is very high, they can basically get a low level of assurance. If their risk appetite is low, then they're transferring the assurance to a third party with all the legal
liabilities.
Liability and cost.
Yeah, all of the legal stuff. Because for us, we have excised certain words in our vocabulary for due diligence. We don't use the words declare, recommend, audit. Why? Because they pose legal issues, liability, indemnification issues that we're really very careful about. I don't know if that helps, but anyway.
Okay. Amy, do you have any questions for Greg?
I do. Greg, you talked about the process for due diligence, but I want to go back to the identification phase as far as identifying risks that pertain to social responsibility. Once you've done the work to identify those risks, how do you mitigate the risks associated with knowing that these different risks exist within the organization? Because the reality is that as you start a process of looking at those risks, you can't boil the ocean. You can't deal with everything at once. You have to prioritize. So how do you mitigate the risks once you know what your risks are?
The risks with a supplier or the client organization?
With whoever's doing this analysis.
Okay. Basically, what we were talking about was scoping or parsing the engagement to something that is doable. And another way to say that is auditable. So essentially, it comes down to who's got the controls, who's got the responsibility, and how do you basically mitigate that? And also your risk level of acceptance for the product or service. Basically what we do, and this is pretty much different for social responsibility, and I think you touched on it already. When we basically do an assessment, say an SR assessment, social responsibility, we don't look at the tools so much as we start at the very top of the organization, board level, exec, and basically talk about the tone at the top. Do they have a culture of responsibility? Do they have a culture of risk control? Do they have a culture of compliance? Do they have a culture of transparency? So if those things are in place, and we call those the soft controls, which are probably the most critical controls, then we look at programmatic business unit controls, then we look at process project controls, and then at the very lowest level we look at what we would call product or transactional service controls.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just comment on that?
Please.
Risk is really an interesting one to try and clarify. Again, I mentioned this at the Ethical Summit on Monday, in that there's so many different places risk can be hiding, from the level that Greg is describing, which is the GRC level, really, the corporate foundational, all the way down to the operational and the tools, which is where Fair Factories resides a lot. But another area of risk that companies don't tend to think about is their actual product development life cycle, how a product gets made. So there's, in my past history, what we've always done is try to look at where along that product development life cycle you can put in place these checks and balances for standard, social compliance standards, regulatory compliance, as well as looking at things like when you release this product to the market, how long is it actually in the market? So a good example of risk would be in the conflict minerals space, where companies need to report in May 2014 to the SEC about their risk associated and whether or not they're conflict free. A lot of companies are boiling the ocean. They're looking at everything instead of targeting a subset where their tin, tantalum, and gold is. But then we see other companies that not only target that specific 3TG area, but they look at where in the product life cycle their product is. So you're gonna, if you have a new product coming out, you're expecting, depending on the product, that it will be out there 5 to 7 years roughly in the market, that you'll have to support it. So you have to look at suppliers that you have to keep in check for the next 5 to 7 years. But if you have a product that's end of life, and that supplier is really, after the next year, they're on the low end of the bell curve, on the end of the tail, they're not really going to be there anymore, you can make a risk-based decision about how much of your resources and time you want to put into qualifying that supplier. So there's point being in all of this, there are so many different places along the path to look for risk, and it's great that folks like Greg are coming at it from the GRC, folks like the corporations themselves, and some of us in the standards and NGO groups are pulling it from the bottoms up. And the hope is we'll meet somewhere in the middle and start to institutionalize these processes. So just a little feedback.
Okay, I want to give Betty a chance here to join us. Hi, Betty.
Good afternoon.
Betty's whole area of expertise is business continuity, and there was a study that the IBM Institute for Business Value conducted on attaining sustainable growth through corporate social responsibility. And they said that the goal of most companies of a socially responsible organization is to be sustainable, responsible growth. So growth is a good thing, right? So
Growth is a good thing.
all of us want our organizations to grow. And so with this goal in mind, how would business continuity planning within the supply chain contribute to attaining that goal?
Another good question. I think, first of all, in the past, business continuity and sustainability have said, oh, we've got sustainability issues going on. We've got business continuity going on. There was never a clue that there was a connection. I think they saw each other as being totally separate entities and having very different goals and objectives. I think we're seeing that starting to change. As part of the whole business continuity cycle, we can work with sustainability people. First of all, when we go through there, we do something called a risk assessment. Well, in that risk, particularly in the supply chain, we look at risky suppliers. And for most corporations, organizations, companies, part of what will make an organization risky is that their ethics and the way they do business don't match with our company. We don't want to inherit their lack of, if you will, their negative sustainability. So we don't want to do that. So we can work together with that. Also, in just the when we do a business impact analysis, we go through and look at the organization when we're doing our business continuity planning, we can look for places where sustainability is not being looked at. Because we look at, when we do business continuity, we look at it enterprise-wide. So we may see some things where we have, if you will, redundancies in our organization that are not making us good, sustainable, if you will, earth inheritors and earth dwellers, because we are taking too much of a footprint where we don't have to. We are duplicating efforts. We are getting supplies that we don't need because everybody's ordering them, and we can be more efficient and do less consuming that way. Even when we look at, in business continuity and disaster recovery, our IT, looking at it from an electrical power perspective regarding sustainability. Part of the things that we see there, power is a big one, and IT is usually in an organization the big power user. And so are there places there where do we need to have it always on, or can it be sometimes always available? And there's a difference in the amount of power we might use. So in every step of business continuity planning, we can actually partner with sustainability, sustainability folks, wherever they may live, and partner with them to be more effective. I think sustainability is very interesting because I look back and I see sustainability now where business continuity was several years ago. Where does it actually live inside the organization? What department is it in? Who owns it? Very much the same as business continuity several years ago. And I think that there's some similarities there that could very well be shared as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it kind of dovetails with what Greg was saying about when he goes into an organization, they look at the what he calls the tone at the top, which
Yes.
is if you don't have that tone at the top that's interested in whatever the program might be or the discipline might be, it's pretty tough to change things from the bottom up.
Exactly. And it's a lot of things, whether you're talking about how you manage your risk or sustainability. Let's look at the reasons a corporation or an organization is interested in that. One, we would hope that it's because they are ethical and that they have moral standards and they want to be good citizens. Beyond that, what are some of the things? Well, maybe it's one of your customers or clients saying, hey, wait a minute, what are you doing about sustainability? Same thing with business continuity in the supply chain. What are you doing about it? The other thing might be that regulations say you will, and I think we're going to start seeing a little bit more of that around sustainability as we have with business continuity. I think conflict minerals are a good example of that, where you choose to be good, or someone's going to ask you to be good, or someone's going to require you to be good. And if we get to the required outcome, whatever the motivator is, we still get the same result.
Yeah, Amy, how about, do you have anything for Betty?
Absolutely. Betty, one of the things that there seems to be movement towards globally is integrated annual reporting and sustainability reporting. And when you look at in the U.S. currently, the requirement is just that we address the risks associated with climate change. Do you think that business continuity planning can actually help a business prepare for future reporting requirements?
Again, I see a dotted line. It's not yet a direct line, but I see that dotted line. I think that both parties could benefit from more integration and coordination if they just sit down and talk. We're going to have to do the sustainability report at the end of the year. We need to know this and this and this and this. Over there in business continuity, what of these things do you know? What have you already investigated? What information do you have that goes right into that report so we don't have to reinvent some wheels? So I definitely think there's some great opportunities to, as I say, and one of the things I always look at, and I see this, we still have a tendency in many of our companies to operate in a silo fashion, and I think we can break down some of those silos and just share information and share concerns, and I think that's one of the good examples of that between sustainability and business continuity. Let's not both do the same work. Let's do the work together or do the work individually and then share it. So I think a lot of that will come into play with those year-end sustainability reports.
Mm.
Yeah, I think I know the silo approach is common in a lot of organizations, but one of the things that I've been seeing, if you look at some of the requirements that are out there, for example, in the electronics industry, Citizenship Coalition Code of Conduct, one of the things they're actually looking for is business continuity planning, and they're calling it disaster recovery.
Yep.
But we're also seeing that within our customer surveys that we receive, and it's the disaster recovery and business continuity planning is always included on the social responsibility or sustainability tab, whatever they're calling that, within their questionnaires. So it's interesting to see that it is, so closely tied within at least within the electronics industry, from the customer base as well as the industry coalitions.
And if I may, I think we're seeing this in a lot of areas. If we think back, that we have risk and we have quality and we have business continuity and we have sustainability. I see a lot of those lines between those practices, if you will, getting less and less firm. As I say, they're more dotted lines, and I think we're seeing more overlap, which is good because I think we have a better understanding of one another's concerns. On the other hand, again, I think what we have to watch out for is this not to everybody doing the same work 14 times and that lack of communication coordination among those different business units, I think, can benefit everyone and the organization as a whole, which is what we work for.
Mm. Well, thank you. I have kind of a general question that I'd like to pose for each panelist, and this is off the cuff, totally unprepared.
Great.
From
Love
from
it.
from your perspective in the areas that you deal with, where do you think organizations in general are on the maturity curve of becoming really socially responsible? The reason I ask that is because I go around and I see, you always see labels and advertising about their, what I would call their social responsibility activities, and most of it has to do with environmental stuff. That's the area that gets all the hype more than anything else, I think. But there's always the problem of what we call greenwashing, where they say they're green, but they're not really green. They say they're green because it's a good marketing thing to say, but when you actually look at the product, it's not very green at all. It's no different than any other non-green product. So obviously, there's a certain level of maturity that organizations come to. Where do you think we are, particularly in the U.S.? If you have an opinion, please.
I can take that one. Laura, I'll start us off.
Okay.
So it really depends on which industry you're looking at. I've been fortunate over the last years to work across all the major ones: aerospace, industrial, electronics, automotive, medical device, and now retail. And so I've gotten to see these different levels of where companies are, and by far electronics is the furthest ahead of most. So on a scale of 1 to 10, electronics is probably at a 4 going towards a 5. Most of the major players have robust programs for environmental compliance and social compliance. In those industries, though, where you start going down the supply chain, they're not tier 1 suppliers anymore, then they don't tend to have as much in place. What they're doing is they're kind of watching, well, what are these tier 1 suppliers doing? And then I'll follow their lead. And sometimes that's really great because you have leaders out there in each of these industries driving change and asking questions in the supply chain. But sometimes it's also confusing to these tiers below tier 1 because they're getting requests in a lot of different formats from a lot of different companies, and it makes it hard to do data collection and analysis. But if I had to list based on what I've seen so far, I would say electronics is leading, and then automotive and probably retail have really robust areas of social compliance. Then probably medical device, except medical device is ahead in other ways because they've been doing all the FDA transparency stuff for quite some time. And then going towards the aerospace and the industrials. So a lot of the heavy equipment manufacturers don't necessarily have to do these things because they get exempt due to government regulations and contracts. It's starting to phase into them, and some do have programs, but the leaders are really electronics, automotive, retail, and medical device.
Yeah, it's kind of like to quote Yogi Berra, it's kind of like deja vu all over again.
It is.
With those of us in quality land have seen many things like this. We've seen it with TQM, we've seen it with Six Sigma, we've seen it with the ISO standards world, where it takes a while for people to get it. And
but I think there's something making it race to the finish, though, because of social media, when something goes wrong, you can't hide anymore. Like the collapse of Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, I mean, that went viral. People found out about that in a matter of seconds. So companies have this emphasis where, 100 years ago when industry was ramping up, if they exploited people or did something that was environmentally bad, the whole world didn't know about it. Now, in a matter of seconds, the whole world knows if something's gone wrong. So that puts an extra pressure to do the right thing on a lot of these companies.
Betty, what's your impression?
I think we've got a long way to go, but we're going, and that's one of the things. And as I say, part of it depends on what's driving an organization to do it. Some organizations will just do it because it's the right thing to do. They're socially responsible. It's part of their culture. Others, it's going to take customers and clients saying, hey, we want to work with you, we want to buy with you, but here's what we want from you. And that's where we go on to suppliers, first tiers, and on down to the other tiers. And then there's the regulations. Some organizations aren't going to really move forward to this until some government agency, unfortunately, says you will, or there are going to be fines and other consequences. And then, as Kelly mentioned, another big motivator is public relations, and we've seen a lot of examples of that in the garment industry. Yes. Where's that blouse made? Where are those shoes made? What kind of conditions are there where that product is being made? And that's a driver. So a lot of it is some companies, I say, they'll do it on their own, and I think when we say that in any industry or business, we're at this level, well, we've got to remember that level is the average. And within that average, there are some companies in that group who are head and shoulders above everyone else, and there are others who are clear down at the bottom and dragging their feet. So it's, and I would agree with every one of Kelly's rankings of, the big grouping of organizations, but within each one of those groups, I think the range is wide.
Yes, absolutely.
Greg, how about you?
Wow, that's a tough question. I'll share with you a corporate response, which is probably not too popular too often. They look at it in terms of an ROI.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
What's the business case? Exactly.
Essentially, it's the business case. And we saw a lot of offshoring, largely because of U.S. legal compliance, the cost of legal compliance. If a company, global company, basically has a hit, an offshore hit for whatever reason, and it impacts their, what we call their reputational risk, again, it's a risk issue, they can see their market cap evaporate 20-30% in one day. So you've got a $20 billion company, you see a 20% hit, all of a sudden their market cap went from 20 billion to probably 16 billion in one day. It'll probably take them 5 years to recoup that. So they're doing a lot of greenwashing, PR, probably preventive, proactive, to ensure a lot of that. And that's one reason when we are doing sort of our due diligence assessments, we don't call them audits for probably legal reasons. When we're doing we focus on the GRC piece on the top, and we'll issue a letter, a management letter, or some other document. But we won't provide assurance, because right now, what we're seeing, and that's very unfortunate, and Kelly used the number 4 out of 10 in terms of maturity and capability, that's the best we have in this country. I would agree with that, and probably of a lot of our clients, it's even lower than that, unfortunately. But that's the reality. I think in 4 years, when we have more global warming, the seas rise 2 or 3 feet, Betty is going to be busier than she knows that she can. She'll have more business than she knows what to do with. And Kelly, well, you'll have a place in Malibu.
Unfortunately, it takes crisis sometimes to get people to act. But there are, and in fairness to a lot of the corporations out there, I have worked with a lot of corporations that have really robust programs and want to do the right thing.
Yep.
I mean, in the retail space, the Adidas's, the Timberlands, the REI's, they are all working very diligently to have these robust compliance programs. In electronics, you name the big players, and they all have robust programs too, where they're going all the way down and looking at the materials in their products. So, I mean, you see a wide range, but it is happening, and those companies will lead the other tiers in the future into more conformed social compliance and environmental compliance. So there's hope. There is hope.
Knock on wood. Knock on wood as I knock on my forehead.
There's hope. I see a lot of, we tend to focus on the negative that's going on, but in the circle I'm in, I also see a lot of positive change. I see, because it's, a corporation has its culture, but that culture is made up of people. And
Right.
people have their values that they bring to the table and what they want to fight for. So
Yeah.
hopefully, it's a positive spin.
Just one thing I noticed when I first got involved with the whole social responsibility initiative with ASQ and started presenting it to our member leaders in venues that we have annually, and talking about social responsibility. A lot of the people, and these are quality professionals, a lot of them say, well, my company already does this stuff. We don't necessarily call it social responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
but we already do this stuff. We've always done it this way, and so forth. So those are the leaders that people really need to look up to if they want to see how to do this thing and get it done right. And the whole thing that Betty brought up about some companies won't do it until there's a regulation that tells them they must do it or else somebody goes to jail. Um,
I've seen that
unfortunately,
too. I can validate it.
yeah, and unfortunately, we may be headed in that direction.
But the thing is, part of it is resource oriented because
Sure.
there are a lot of regulations out there right now, and crawling those supply chains, getting data collected, and then bringing it in-house and analyzing it and finding out whether or not you're doing the right things, that is a huge challenge. Transparency in the supply chain is where everything is moving toward over the years to come, but it is a huge data collection, data gathering effort. And then to step back and do supply chain dashboards from that and create analytics so that you can make better decisions is a huge task.
Right, and people in quality land are very biased to making data-based decisions and not emotional decisions.
Yes.
And so anything that will help that is
Well,
a
and tying it to
positive thing.
cost as well, tying it to
Yeah.
cost. So there's a lot of
Right.
models out there now trying to tie actual cost to social issues as well, not just physical, tangible return on investment projects.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'd like to give each of you an opportunity for just a few final remarks before we sign off. Um, I don't know if any listeners, if we have live listeners, have input any questions to the panel, and I'm sure our mission control in Milwaukee would be able to communicate those to us somehow. I don't know how, but we'll let them handle that. And if not, how about a few final remarks, and then I'll ask Amy for a final remark, and then I think we can sign off. To me, this has been very informative, and I think people that view this when it's posted on YouTube or on our website or on any websites, they'll really appreciate the input that you've provided because it's been very informative. So why don't we start with Greg? Any final comments?
Final comments. Just want to thank ASQ and you guys, Amy and Dick, and the panelists for having us, and great job. I learned a lot as well. Thank you.
Okay, Betty.
Again, I've enjoyed it. I'd love to sit around with all of you with a cup of coffee, or maybe after 6 o'clock a glass of wine and talk about this some more. I really have enjoyed it. Only parting, not words of wisdom, but just some things to keep in mind. More and more, the lines between some of our concerns in our organizations, again, risk, quality, business continuity, regulatory things, those lines are getting, we're kind of getting closer and closer, and the lines are morphing a little bit. In your organizations, go out and know who the people are who are responsible for those other arenas. Sit down and talk with them. You have some of the same concerns, and you can be very helpful to one another in getting where we all need to go.
Thank you. And Kelly.
Again, like everybody else, thanks for the opportunity to talk about some of these issues that are near and dear to my heart. parting words would be, think about how you can operationalize environmental compliance and sustainability metric gathering throughout your product development lifecycle and then throughout your supply chains. And always think about your tier 1 suppliers that you're collecting data. How can you help them or enable them to look further back in the supply chain? Because over the coming years, transparency in the supply chain is inevitable. And companies and people are going to need to know, where are these raw materials coming from, who's putting it together, who are the employees and workers around the world involved, and how are they being treated. And then finally, we're all in this together, so share knowledge when you go to conferences, when you do stuff like this. Share what you can and learn from those around you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, Amy.
It was very interesting to hear from these 3 different perspectives as someone who is using these tools, working in a electronics manufacturer responsible for sustainability reporting, working with customer requirements and the Electronics Industry Citizenship Coalition Code of Conduct. Seeing that the direction that we're taking is in alignment with what I'm hearing from people who are knowledgeable in these areas is very helpful for me, and I hope that others will find this information useful within their own organizations as well.
Well, thank you. And I guess my final comment is speaking to all the folks that might be listening who live in quality land. It's very evident to me that our area of involvement and expertise is expanding dramatically.
Yep.
Looking at the futures study that was conducted by ASQ, the number 1 factor that came out of that study that would be driving the quality profession and quality professionals in the future is global responsibility, which I look at as being social responsibility. So anything that applies to that is something that should be of interest to every quality professional. And our toolkit is getting bigger, and we should continue to learn, continue to educate ourselves and learn more so that we maintain our relevance in the organizations that we work in. So I'm assuming that Dave and Mission Control is controlling us somehow, so he will. There he is.
There he is.
Dave, you're going to have to be the one to sign us off, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, I can do that. And thank you all. I learned a tremendous amount. This was a great conversation. So in response to your question, Dick, we haven't received any direct questions, just a couple of comments, additional kudos. So thank you, everyone. If you're watching a recording of this, please feel free to leave a comment either on YouTube if you're watching that, or if you're watching it on the sro.org or the website that happens to get posted on there. Feel free to leave questions in the comment features. We'll respond to those as they're received. So I will end things here. And once again, thank you everyone for your time. This is really great.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.